For a moment the Major was certain that an icy chill passed between the two ladies. He could feel it in his bones. And then he remarked seriously to Olympia, "Now you have gone and ruined my reputation." Miss Peabody had become the fiery red of pure rage. She remarked simply, "Nonsense! You're a man." "But haven't you," the Major said, "haven't you rubbed it into me enough that a man has to be just as careful about these things as a woman? Aren't you always saying that a man ought to be as spotless as a nun? Isn't that why you're president of the Boston Society for Reforming Young Men? And now, Olympia, you have ruined my reputation forever." But Miss Peabody, who was growing redder and redder, positively hissed between her teeth, "This appears to me to be nonsense." And she snapped at Miss Delamere the words, "What are you doing here?" Miss Delamere answered, in a quite determined tone, "Well, for the matter of that, what are you doing here?" There seemed to the Major nothing to remain but to treat the whole thing in a spirit of sheer farce. As far as he could see, his hands were perfectly clean, but he simply wouldn't face the least chance of proving it. And for the matter of that, all these women's reputations would be damaged, and there would be a regular beastly scandal if he didn't do his level best to carry the whole thing off with a hand light enough for the whipping of syllabubs. And he just said, "In the name of heaven, what are we all doing here?" And Olympia, dropping for a moment the cold purity of her training, remarked harshly, "Now that's enough of this. I want an explanation." "That's just it," the Major said. "That's just exactly what Mrs. Kerr Howe wanted. I'm no good at explanations. You'd better ask Flossie." Miss Peabody remarked, as was to be expected of her, "Flossie, indeed!" And then she fixed Miss Delamere with a baleful glare. "Well, I'm waiting." "So am I," Miss Delamere said. "And if you want to know what I'm waiting for, it's this. I've been brought down to this place in the interests of the pure drama. It doesn't seem to me that I ought to be exposed to the chances of finding unmarried American ladies in gentlemen's bedrooms." "Edward!" Miss Peabody exclaimed tragically, "are you going to see me exposed to these insults?" "But, my poor dear Olympia," the Major said, "she is only expressing what I told you I felt myself. Oh, hang it all, I can't explain. The only thing left seems to be for Juliana to do it." And he called out, "Aye, Mrs. Kerr Howe, come out from behind that curtain." For it had suddenly occurred to him that there were 10 chances to 1 that the lady would be discovered, and there was nothing in the world to prevent her being used even at that late date as a chaperone. She must, by all reasonable chances, be under his thumb. And when Mrs. Kerr Howe, with a face pale with rage, came around the foot of the bed, he said to Miss Delamere, whom he could trust to leg him up, "Oh, I say, put a screen in front of the fireplace. There will be another woman coming down the chimney, and it might not look decorous." Mrs. Kerr Howe exclaimed sharply, "Major Foster, I insist upon an explanation of this insult." Almost at the same moment as Miss Peabody asked, "Who is this person?" The Major said, with all the air of a calm introducer, "Let me introduce Mrs. Kerr Howe to you. Mrs. Kerr Howe, the authoress of the future pure drama. I brought her down by the last train with me." "So it appears," Miss Peabody exclaimed. And then she added, "I know all about Mrs. Kerr Howe." And at almost the same moment Miss Delamere said in a quite audible voice, "Good old Teddy." Mrs. Kerr Howe and Olympia were maintaining an ominous silence. And then the Major got his idea. He'd been thinking of once more claiming Flossie as his half-sister, because his aunt might be trusted to leg him out. Just then, what he thought was inspiration came to him, and he exclaimed, "That's right. That's how I like to see you, nice and friendly. We shall all be kissing and making friends in a minute or two." "That we certainly shan't," Miss Peabody said. He took no notice of her, but drew his breath for a long speech. "Oh, yes, we shall," he began as soon as I've given my explanation. "I've got it. It's as clear as mud. See here, Juliana, you came down with me in the last train, didn't you? And you, Flossie, you were dying to tell me all about your new theater. And so you, Juliana, very kindly offered to chaperone Flossie and to help explain about the new Pure Theater. So there we were, all three comfortably sitting over the fire, when Flossie remembered that she'd forgotten to bring the plans of the new theater, so of course Flossie went to get the plans, so Juliana was left alone with me. I don't see anything wrong about that. Olympia, do you?" "But why," Miss Peabody asked suspiciously, "did Miss Delamere leave her shoes?" It was then that the Major made what was very nearly a fatal mistake. For, as it occurred to him afterward, nothing would have been easier than to say that Flossie just didn't want to make a noise, instead of which he said, "Oh, the shoes? Well, you see, they were a little present I was going to bring you from Paris, and Flossie was wearing them so as to air them and to prevent my having to pay customs duty, so of course, when Flossie went away, she left the shoes on the grate, because, you know, they're really your shoes. She couldn't take them. And really, it's you who ought to explain how your shoes came to be found by my grate." Olympia again became very red. "I don't understand what all this rigmarole is about," she said. "Oh, go away and think it over," the Major exclaimed quite cheerfully. "It explains everything." "But it doesn't," Olympia exclaimed. "If the shoes are already in this country, why should you have to pay customs duty on them?" "Oh," the Major answered, "I was going to give them to you in Paris. It would have been French customs duty." "But I'm not going to Paris," Miss Peabody said. "Well, you see," the Major answered, "I'm a man who likes to be prepared for everything. I thought that one day you might be going to Paris, and so it would be nice to have them all ready to give you. You ought to regard it as a touching attention on my part, instead of kicking up such a terrible row. And all about a pair of shoes. Oh, Olympia, I'm ashamed of you." Miss Peabody exclaimed ominously, "Major Brent Foster!" And the Major, though he didn't at the moment know why, felt a sudden gush of joy. Nevertheless, he said, "Major Brent Foster? Why don't you call me Edward? Or even Teddy?" "Because," Olympia exclaimed, "I believe that it is all over between us." Miss Delamere exclaimed, just under her breath, "Poor fellow!" For a moment the Major felt a strong inclination to leave it at that, and he would have left it if there hadn't come into his rather chivalrous soul the disagreeable idea of all these women's reputations. There would be Miss Peabody going envenomedly around the world, miscalling in a quite skilful manner not only Mrs. Kerr Howe, but Flossie, who certainly hadn't deserved it. And there would certainly be Mrs. Kerr Howe going about casting doubts on the virtue of poor Olympia, who equally didn't deserve it. So he exclaimed, "Oh, do let us have a little common sense. Haven't I explained everything?" "No, you explained nothing at all," Miss Peabody said. "In the first place, Miss Delamere was just as much astonished as I was to see Mrs. Kerr Howe here at all." "Of course, she would be," the Major said. "She had been gone from the room a long time. She naturally expected to find that Juliana would be gone when she came back. It wouldn't have been proper for Juliana to be here alone without Flossie on hand to chaperone her." "But why," Olympia asked, "did Mrs. Kerr Howe hide behind the bed-curtain if she hadn't a guilty conscience?" "Why, that," the Major said, "that's because she has such a kind heart. Mrs. Kerr Howe has the kindest heart of any woman that I know. She hid behind the curtain in order to spare your blushes, Olympia. She thought you would have been embarrassed if you knew you were discovered coming to my room like this, because of course it makes it so much worse your being engaged to me. So she hid behind the curtain so that you shouldn't know she knew. That explains that." He didn't in the least know how it happened, but suddenly he was aware of the voice of her ladyship's own maid, and that the white cap and strings of the white apron of Miss Jenkins were in the room. She was standing at the foot of the bed with her hands clasped before her, and her mysterious, confidentially confident air of the really good servant who, being above all the vicissitudes and tragedies of this earth, can put everything right by a suggestion or two. And she was remarking in the most perfectly level tones, "Wouldn't it be much better, sir, just to tell the truth? I'm sure there's nothing in the least wrong about the truth, sir." The Major suddenly fell down again into his armchair. "My God, Flossie," he exclaimed, "you can take the screen away from the front of the fire again. She's come by the secret door instead of the chimney." The high voice of Miss Peabody sounded in the room. "Perhaps you will kindly explain your presence." Miss Jenkins stood with her hands still down, as if she were smoothing out her apron. "Well, miss," she said, "I'm in charge of this house in the interest of her ladyship, Mary Countess Saville." "But that doesn't explain why you're here," Miss Peabody repeated. "Well, miss, you see, miss," Miss Jenkins continued calmly, "I heard a great noise of quarrelling, if you'll excuse me, miss, and so I came to see if you mightn't be breaking the furniture over one another, if you'll excuse my being so free, miss, since it's my duty to look after the furniture. There's some very valuable things here in this room. Now, this panel, for instance, I'm sure her ladyship would be heartbroken if anything happened to this panel. For the painting, it's by Van Dyck, and if one of you was to throw the other against it, it might be very bad for its works. It works like this, miss, don't you see, miss?" And Miss Jenkins moved calmly toward the frame of the panel. The knob moved so easily that she appeared, in the gloom, merely to wave her hand, and the panel no more to exist. Instead, there was the brilliant light of Miss Delamere's room shining in upon them all. The Major exclaimed, "Well, now, that explains everything." But Miss Peabody merely answered, "I am not a bit satisfied, and nothing is explained." "But don't you see," the Major asked, "that's Flossie's room. That's how she came to be here." Miss Peabody said icily, "I quite understand that, Major Foster. It only makes it all the worse." Once more Miss Jenkins interposed. "If I might make so bold, miss, as to ask you to listen to me, miss." "That you certainly may not," Miss Peabody said. "I'm not used to being talked to by servants." "Of course, that's your American way, miss," Miss Jenkins said, with a calmness of extreme insolence. "You are so democratic. But this is England, miss, and you see I'm sort of foster sister to the Countess, and she treating me just as if I were her equal, it makes me a little free in my speech with such old friends of the Countess as Major Foster is. So I hope you'll pardon me, miss, if I ask you to think the best you can of Major Foster, for I'll give you my word of honour, if you'll take a servant's word, being so American-like, and remembering that you're in England, that the Major is perfectly innocent, though apt to be a little frivolous in such things as explanations, miss." There seemed to have arisen between these two women, from the very sight of each other, one of those bitter hatreds of which only women are capable. And it was with a rudeness really extraordinary that Miss Peabody answered, "No, I'll certainly not take your word. No servant ever spoke the truth." "That's because you're used to American servants, miss, if I may make so bold," Miss Jenkins answered. "We only export inferior ones to the United States. Her ladyship and such like keep the best at home." "It's no good talking," Miss Peabody attempted to close the discussion. "I'm not the one to act precipitately, but I shall certainly act." "That was what I wanted to suggest, your ladyship. I beg pardon, miss," Miss Jenkins said. "But being so much with her ladyship, it seems to come natural-like. What I wanted to suggest was that you shouldn't come to any determination for a day or two, and then you can keep an eye upon the Major and these ladies, and see how they behave." At this point, Miss Delamere exclaimed again, "Poor old Teddy!" "That's precisely what I intend to do," Miss Peabody said. "But don't you imagine that it is at your suggestion I shall keep an eye on these people. And if I observe anything in the least suspicious, I shall break off my engagement with Major Foster at once." "What?" the Major exclaimed. "Isn't it broken off already?" "I shall break off my engagement at once," Miss Peabody continued, "and then I shall go to Mr. Foster and tell him why, and that will be the end of your theatre, Miss Delamere, and your play, Mrs. Curhow, and Major Foster will be cut out of his uncle's will." "And very proper, too, Miss Jenkins said. "I didn't ask you to make a remark," Miss Peabody exclaimed, and then she said clearly and distinctly, "Edward, you may kiss me. To show these ladies—" The Major started violently. "Oh," he said, and he pointed to the door behind Miss Peabody's back. "Oh, the dog! George Washington's just run out the door." Miss Peabody wavered for a moment, and then she turned toward the door. She disappeared, and they could hear her calling in the corridor, "Georgie! Georgie!" The Major pulled out his handkerchief and wiped his forehead. "Thank heaven that taught me that lie," he said. "Didn't the dog go out of the door?" Mrs. Curhow said. "Not a bit," the Major answered cheerfully. "The little beast is under my bed. But if that lie hadn't come into my head, I should have had to kiss Olympia. And think how painful that would have been for all of you." At that point, Miss Jenkins remarked, in her cool and businesslike tones, "I think, if you'll excuse me, Mrs. Curhow and Miss Delamere, you had better just go through that panel into Miss Delamere's room, and then I'll close it. If the dog is still here, it's likely Miss Olympia will be coming back, and you'd better not be seen here again." "Oh, yes," the Major exclaimed energetically. "Good gracious! Go, go!" And he positively pushed them through the opening. Miss Delamere smiled at him maliciously over her shoulder. "Aren't you going to kiss us good night, Teddy?" she asked. But Miss Jenkins fatefully extended her hand to the frame, and the portraits of her ladyship's ancestors marched right across Miss Delamere's face. End of Part 1, Chapter 7.